Getting to the commercial general liability, remember it is built into the BOP and then you write it separately for the CPP. Okay, so what is the commercial general liability? When you think about liability, it's always about bodily injury and property damage to a third party. But the CGL policy includes more than that. So we'll talk about that. It can include some personal injury. So, like I said, there's going to be two forms. You're going to either write it on an occurrence form or a claims made form. Now, everything I'm going to show you is the same for both of these forms. It has the same coverages, it has the same exclusions. It works the same with limits. But what is the difference is how it is triggered. And so, what I'm going to do is show you the things that are common between the two forms, and then we'll circle back around and I'll show you the difference. Okay, so that's kind of keep that in mind. Like I said, most of your most of your CGLs are going to be written on the occurrence form. So let's talk about what is the same for each one of these, and then we'll talk about the difference between them. Now, for the different coverages, you have coverage A, coverage B, coverage C. You have coverage A, and think about bodily injury and property damage. And there's some different types of hazards here: premises, operations, completed operations, contractual, and contingent. I'm going to show you each one of those. And again, this is a business. What if they get sued? Okay, and think third party. What's a third party? Like a customer, right? That's going to be our major third party. The other coverage is personal injury and advertising. It automatically comes in the CGL policy. In the homeowner policy, you don't have personal injury automatically. You have to endorse it. Here, it's coverage B. So we'll go over that coverage. And then coverage C is medical payments per person. Very similar to the homeowner policies. What if somebody slips, a third party slips on the premises, and the business isn't legally liable. They weren't negligent, but the customer just slipped and fell. And so it's a no fault coverage, just like you have in the homeowner world. Okay, so we'll talk about these three coverages here. Now, when you're talking about coverage A, bodily injury and property damage, there's basically six types of coverages, six types of things that can happen for a third party. Now, think about it this way: not every business is going to have that exposure. But most businesses will probably have a premises exposure. What if a third party think customer slips and falls in the insured store? That's your premises exposure. So when you think premises, slips and falls. Operations, that is an exposure that, for example, a contractor could have. If a contractor is doing, installing an electrical outlet and they damage the customer's countertop in the process, that's property damage to a third party. That's in their operation. So that's an exposure that would fall under here. Products, when you think products, think like a manufacturer. If a manufacturer were to, there was recently a stroller recall, and what would happen was the particular manufacturer that manufactured the strollers, fortunately, no babies were severely injured, but as they had the babies in the stroller, they were walking, the stroller would fold up, and there were some injuries there. And so because of that products, that is an exposure. Restaurants have a product exposure too. They're making food. What if they make food and, they use some ingredients that weren't exactly fresh and people got food poisoning? So there's product exposures. Like I said, not every business is going to have, but there's six types of coverages that a business could have. Completed operations. Again, a contractor comes in, they install a washing machine. After they leave, the hose comes off. And, now the customer's flooring is buckling and there's lots of damage there, maybe some drywall damage if it seeps in. So that is completed operations, property damage that could happen to a third party. Then there's some contractual issues that you have. Now, courts, of course, frown on you taking someone else's liability. But if it's a situation in our logistics society where you're brought into a lawsuit just because you have a relationship with someone, you should be protected under that person's policy. So I'm going to show you some six ways. There's basically six or seven ways that an insurance company will say, okay, contractual is okay, we will cover it. And it's basically, think about it's putting the liability where it should be. So for example, owners of a building and tenants. We may have an easement, somebody that rents out their land to someone. So there are some contractual responsibilities, but you can't just assume someone else's liability unless it is an insured contract. So we'll talk about those different things there. Contingent, sometimes a general contractor, will be responsible for their subcontractors' faulty work. And so those are some exposures. So again, these are some different types of coverage that can happen with bodily injury and property damage to a third party. Now, when you're talking about personal injury and advertising, think libel, slander, false arrest. Those are typically your three major exposures. False arrest is huge for like a shopping center. If they accuse somebody of shoplifting, a watch, and they embarrass this person and they find out, oh, they bought that watch here two weeks ago, and I just accused them of shoplifting, and they sue them, those are things that we're talking about. So libel, slander, false arrest. Now, the CGL policy makes it clear these are some things we cover, but we also want you to know what is not covered, and usually it's knowingly and intentional. And you say, well, how would they know if they knowingly or intentionally did something? Well, sometimes they go to court. You see a lot of these as court cases, but knowingly inflicting injury that violates the rights of another, oral or written publication of material that the insured knows is false but publishes anyway, intentional slanderous statements, again, these are excluded. Material that was, of course, published before the effective date is not going to be covered. Failure of goods to conform with advertised quality. If you're selling, for example, diet pills, a manufacturer, and they say lose 10 pounds in a week, and you get sued because they didn't, that is something that's not going to be covered under this policy. That's why they'll have little disclaimers on everything. Also, unauthorized use of another's name or product in the insured's email address. Incorrect prices on goods. If you meant to sell something for $1,000 and you sold it for, 10, and you put a tag on it for $10, that's not going to be covered. So personal injury and advertising, libel, slander, false arrest. Now, it doesn't include bodily injury because bodily injury is over here under coverage A, and it doesn't include sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is a total different coverage. That's employment practices. I have a class out there that we talk about employment practices, that type of thing. It's a 6-hour commercial class. So keep in mind, sexual harassment is not going to be covered here either. So libel, slander, false arrest, that's kind of what we're thinking about when it comes to a business under coverage B. But bodily injury and property damage is, your physical harm. Coverage B, personal injury and advertising, intangible harms to the reputation, rights, or business practices. So when you're thinking of bodily injury, property damage, think of those slips and falls, products, completed operations, products type claims that you have with restaurants as well. Libel, slander, defamation. Another thing with personal injury is wrongful eviction or invasion of privacy. Landlords have a huge personal and advertising or personal injury exposure there. So you have, this coverage B here and then coverage A as well. And we're going to talk about some different exclusions in just a moment. Now, your coverage C is medical payments. And with coverage A and B, they have to be legally liable, the business. They have to be negligent. They have to be at fault. Under coverage C, medical payments, this is for bodily injury to a third person, and they're made without regard to fault, unlike the other coverage A and B. Kind of think about a homeowner policy with medical payments. Now, this particular coverage has a sublimit. Now, I'm going to show you how the limits work, which are totally different in this world than it is with auto and with homeowners. But with medical payments, think about it does have a sublimit. Usually it's per person, just like it is in the homeowner world. So it may be $1,000, it could be $5,000. There are some exclusions. Of course, employees are excluded because they'll go under workers' comp. It occurs to a person while taking part in athletics. Let's say you have a company picnic and they have a softball game and a third party. So that would probably be a vendor or it could be an employee's spouse, they're third parties, and they get injured. A company could exclude that. All right. And of course, a war is excluded as well. So those are your major coverages that you have. Okay. You have coverage A, B, and C.